I've built over 70 B2B sales teams, and I've also been an SDR, cold calling, trying to make a living. I've been an account executive, trying to close deals. I've also been in board meetings as an executive while things are going well, and I've been in those board meetings while things aren't going well. So I know a thing or two when it comes to building out a reliable sales process and enabling a sales team to be effective. And in this video, what I'd like to share with you is how you can follow a structured process to get out of founder-led sales, so then that way it'll free up your time as a founder, as a leader, to actually lead and have other people manage the sales so you can sleep a little bit easier knowing that your sales isn't going to dip if you don't have the time to dedicate to it. So I'm gonna start us off here with the best possible place to begin, which are the three main things you must realize before you start to hire your first salesperson. The first thing here is this is gonna be a lot easier if you have something to hand off. So if right now you don't have any lead gen, you're not booking any appointments, you don't have any inbound, you're not doing any outbound activities, I would start there before hiring somebody. Generally what I find mistake-wise that founders make is they try to hire their way into growth. And in reality, it doesn't quite work that way. Sure, you can get lucky and happen to hire the right person, but in the vast majority of cases, not only are you setting you up for failure because you don't know the process required to get meetings on the calendar and eventually close deals, you're setting up the rep for failure. I've seen top performing sales reps go to a different company and not perform well. And I've seen it go the other way too. There's an enablement piece that's important, but regardless of that, and we're gonna get into it a little bit later in this video, you need to have something that you know if you give a sales rep, an SDR, an AE, whoever you're hiring first, if you give them that workflow, you know you can get meetings on the calendar and deals eventually closed from it. So have that first because it's gonna really set you up for success. The next thing here is when you get yourself out of sales, which is presumably what you're doing when you're hiring a sales rep, that's when you need to be the most involved in sales. Generally, what I find is founders try to hire somebody so that they can totally be hands off and just point to the sales rep. Are you performing well? Are you not performing well? But it doesn't work that way. You need to be heavily involved and working with that rep to ensure that they're hitting the numbers they need to hit, which is going to allow you to hit the revenue targets that you need to hit in order to have a sustainable business. And the final thing here before I jump into the meat and potatoes is I want to make sure that you understand through the process of building your own sales process, do not get attached to anyone or anything. Just because you think something's gonna work doesn't mean it will. And you should let the data really be the driver of your decision making. It should tell you if something is working or not. It should also tell you if the person you have doing the job is doing a good job or not. The data doesn't lie. And if you get attached to things and you start reacting emotionally, it's gonna be very difficult to have a sales process that you can rely on. Now, the first thing I want you to do here is I want you to find your break-even number. This is really important. Generally, I run into founders that make a mistake of setting a very aggressive quota from the beginning. And when you have no metrics to base your number setting on, this can be a huge mistake because if it's way too aggressive and doesn't feel possible for the sales reps, they're going to get really demotivated. So what I encourage founders to do when they're first building the team, this doesn't apply to later on, but when you're first building the team, figure out what that team needs to do in order for you to justify keeping the department. What revenue do you need to see on a consistent basis in order to keep the salespeople around? And then the next piece here is figure out how long you're willing to invest to get to that number. These things don't happen overnight, and often it can be tempting to just hire and fire people really quickly because you're trying to figure out if there's a person that works. I call that hiring and hoping, where you hire sales reps, you cross your fingers, close your eyes, and hope that they work out. But they often don't. And you'll find yourself in a position where you're not sure why the team isn't being successful. Am I a bad leader? Is my product bad? Is the rep bad? Do they need more training? What do we got to do? Right? That is not the trap you want to be in. The data saves you from that. And by understanding what you need at a bare minimum in order to keep the department and being committed to a certain length of time to get to the number that you need to get to, you're going to protect yourself from making a bunch of really emotional decisions when in reality you need to be very calm, collected, and execute consistently to figure out what works and what doesn't. Now, to find your break-even number, simply work with whatever your operating margins are, work backwards to figure out how much revenue the sales rep needs to generate on a monthly or quarterly basis to keep their job, to keep that at least at a break even or at the profit margin you need it to be at a bare minimum. I have a sheet that you can use. It's called the growth model. I'll put a link to it down below. Feel free to use that. It's totally free. That's a whole spreadsheet where you can put in your numbers and it'll help calculate this for you. But at a bare minimum, just know what revenue you need that rep or those reps to do in order to justify keeping them around. All right, the next thing that I want to make sure that you have on your radar here as you're starting to get out of founder-led sales is you must know the metrics that are required in order to hit the numbers you're trying to hit. This means working backwards to a daily workflow. Let me explain. First, you're gonna model out each metric and each conversion rate. So let me walk through some of the common ones. Let's say we're doing outbound prospecting to get meetings on the calendar, to eventually close deals. We're going to start with the outbound prospecting or the top of the funnel activity. So that might look like the number of cold calls being made. What percentage of those cold calls do we expect to actually result in somebody answering the phone? If it's a totally cold list, that might be 5-6%. If that list is warmer or more qualified and the data you have is higher quality, maybe that's going to get up to 7, 8, 9, 10%. So you want to have an understanding of that number. If you don't know what it is for you, generally around 5% is normal on a random cold list. Now, when those people answer the phone, we either book a meeting or we don't. What percentage of the time do we actually book a meeting? Is it 5% of the time, 10% of the time, 15, 20%? Generally, the higher that number will come from a message that resonates more with the prospect. So the stronger your value prop, typically the higher the conversion is going to be on the phone. You want to figure out that number for you or make a reasonable estimate. 10% is a fair place to start if you have no idea, but that's a very important number as you start building out this program to keep your eye on. So now we have a meeting booked. What's next? It's, does the meeting actually show up or not? That's your show up rate. And you want to keep this number as high as possible. If you're a very transactional sale and the people you're booking meeting with are business owners and they're very busy, you might see that around 60, 70%, 70% being pretty good. Generally, I try to keep things at 75%, but that can be really high for some industries. It just depends on who you sell to. But you want to try to get that as high as possible. The more complex the sale, the bigger problems that you solve, the higher urgency there are with implementing a solution like yours, you'll generally see that number go higher into like the 80%, but typically I'm modeling this number out between 70 and 80%. Now, do the exact same thing for email, for LinkedIn, whatever channel you're using for prospecting. If it's inbound leads, it's the same thing. What channels are we using? We're using phone, email, LinkedIn in order to book meetings. If it's email, it's number of emails sent, open rate, reply rate. LinkedIn, very similar metrics as email. You get the idea here. We want to track all parts of the sales process and understand our conversions along the way. Because when you have the top of the funnel metrics, then you can figure out of the meetings that I need in order to close the amount of deals I'm looking for. You can work backwards with those percentages to figure out the number of activities required every day in order to hit those numbers. But let's move into the actual sales process here. What we look at after the meeting has shown up is really stage by stage drop off. So between deal stage 1 and deal stage 2, what percent of deals actually drop off at this point? From deal stage 2 to deal stage 3, how many deals drop off at that point? And you want to look at those drop off numbers. Now we're going to talk a bit about deal stages in a few minutes here, but I want to make sure that this is very clear. As you understand where the drop offs are in your process, then you can focus on improving those specific processes. And the collection of all of this really equals your close rate, right? Meeting shows up, close deal, that's your close rate, the percentage of meetings that show up that actually result in a closed deal. But along the way, there's all these drop-offs, and it's important for you to understand those metrics. Now, when you first start working with your team, whether it's on the selling only part or if it's the top of the funnel outbound prospecting part, you want to choose a primary metric. So if you're doing cold calling, you might really try and focus on your connect to meeting booked rate. If your connect rate is super low and you're basically talking to nobody, well, then we need to solve that problem. So have your top priority metric that you're looking to fix. And then as you work with salespeople, it's the same sort of thing. Do we want to focus on our deal stage 1 to deal stage 2 drop off. Maybe it's very high. Or maybe it isn't high and things are dropping off between deal stage 2 and deal stage 3. We'll focus there. Have a primary metric that you're working on and work with the team to make that metric as good as it can be before moving to the next one. All right, so we talked about finding your break-even number, and we even talked pretty extensively around metrics that you should be tracking and how you should allow those metrics to drive some of your decision making. The next thing I really want to dive into are the expectations that you're setting for the sales team. You need to set clear expectations on what the sales reps or the SDRs, AEs, whatever you're calling them, what do you got to do on a daily basis in order to hit your number? We set the number by finding our break-even number, right? What number do we need them to do at the bare minimum? And maybe you even went a little above that, right, to give you some wiggle room. We have the number. We need to give the workflow. We need to set the expectations. So the first part of that is, what is the required outcome? As a sales rep, as an SDR, how many deals do you need to close per month or per quarter? How many meetings need to be booked per month or per quarter? Have a clear objective set for the SDRs and the AEs. Now, AEs is pretty simple. They're closing. So generally that metric is going to be around closed deals. It might be a revenue number. It might be a number of deals, a unit number. But for SDRs, and generally, I recommend one thing, which is meetings that showed up, qualified meetings that showed up. There's got to be some basic objective qualifications, so things that are binary, that the sales rep or whoever's doing the demo or doing the first sales call doesn't have a feeling about, right? These are things that are either true or not true. Not, I feel like it's this way or that way. Have objective qualifications. They showed up. That's what I'm looking for from the SDRs, and that's what we're compensating on. So set those goals for the team so they have them. From there, we're also giving the team members the daily expectations. So for an SDR, we might say we need 100 activities per day, because if you do that, we know you'll hit your number and you're going to make the money that you want to make, and we're going to hit the targets that we're trying to hit. So it's very important that you work backwards. Same with account executives. You work backwards to the daily activities they need to do. So if they're doing their own prospecting, there's going to be a prospecting number. If there's a certain amount of demos that they need to do per day in order to hit their metrics, then that's going to be there. You want to make sure you have clear daily expectations so the reps know what they should be doing on a daily basis. You need to make 100 cold calls. You need to make 50 cold calls and send 50 emails. You need to send 50 emails, 30 LinkedIn messages, and then make 80 cold calls. Whatever it looks like for you and your workflow, have it, give it to the reps, and have them execute on that workflow. And the simpler you make that, the better, because you can really start understanding the effectiveness of your outreach with that channel. So for example, if you're just using cold calling, you can really focus on cold calling and optimizing that process before having the reps do any other parts of the workflow like email or LinkedIn, because as you add channels, it adds more complexity to the workflow and actually can hurt their results. So really be intentional about what you're asking the team members to do on a daily basis. So then that way their workflows are simple, but you're also getting the information you need in order to optimize that process. The next thing here is understand the conversion rates that are required in order to hit the number that you're asking the reps to hit. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier. When I was saying we have our dial to connect rate, email open rate, right? Open to reply rate. When you know all those numbers and you model out what they should be or what they need to be in order to hit the target we're trying to hit, that's what you're giving to the team. We need a dial to connect rate of 7%. We need a connect to meeting booked rate at 10%. And when the rep isn't in that range, now you know where you need to work with that rep on. So it's important that you have a really good understanding of those conversion rates and where they need to be. From there, it's about picking the conversion rates that don't line up with the model that you put together and working with the reps to improve that conversion rate. So if the email reply rates are really low, you're going to work with the sales rep or the SDR on how to improve their emails to get more replies. Maybe their open rates are bad and you're going to work with them on improving their subject lines. This is that part of the iterative process very early on that you have to do in order to build some structure around the sales team. The objective here, and this is incredibly important, is you need to understand the relationships between the activities that the reps are doing to get to their number and the outcomes that they're getting. When you understand the relationship between the activities and the outcomes, the entire thing changes, because that relationship allows you to model out what the team has to look like from the number of people, number of activities, and the conversion rates in order to hit the targets that you need to hit. And by understanding the relationship between activities and outcomes, you're going to better be able to do that, and you're going to be able to better coach and support the reps in their pursuit of hitting their targets. That brings me to my next thing here, which is enable the reps. Whether you're hiring SDRs or AEs, it's irrelevant. You have to enable them. And when you're doing prospecting, where you have somebody doing cold outreach and reaching out to potential customers, the list is everything. Early on, especially with outbound, the list is the strategy. So whatever you're planning on spending, time and money-wise on the list, 5x it. And I want you to be really intentional about the leads that are on that list. So what does that mean? Well, what I'll do is I'll generally, and this is what I recommend for list building, is I'll generally go into a tool like Apollo, ZoomInfo, whatever it might be, and build out a list of companies that meet certain criteria. So you might use industry, that's okay. Generally, I like to use keywords. So these are keywords that might be found in those company descriptions. And I'm trying to narrow down the list. I'll use geography. I'll use keywords, industry. I'll use sometimes zip code instead of a city, instead of a region. I'll use zip codes and try to get really specific on areas that I want to target. And your goal is to try to get the list down to as small and as manageable of a size as possible. From there, you have a whole list of companies, right, and their websites. What you're doing is you're going to give that to somebody, either your rep or you're going to hire someone on Upwork. And the goal is to have that person go through website by website and make sure that each one of those companies meets your ideal customer profile. So at first you're going to do the 10 of them, 20 of them, and you're going to record yourself going through 10 or 20 different websites and determining if it's worth reaching out to them or not. That is going to help you set the criteria that you're going to tell somebody else to look for. That person's going to go through the entire company list, and it's going to take a long time for these people, so you might have to hire a few folks on Upwork to get through a larger list. But the idea is, once we've had the human go through it, now we have a list of companies that we're very confident are the right fit. There'll always be junk that gets slipped in here and there. People make mistakes, but generally we know that these companies, they've been looked at, they seem like they could be a good fit for a product or service. From there, we're taking that list of companies and websites of those companies, and we are running them through a database to try to find the decision makers at just those companies. And that's how you build the list. If you have multiple decision makers, you're going to have multiple people per company. If you have one decision maker, there's going to be one person per company. Now, which data provider to use is going to depend. Everyone has different coverage, so I recommend giving a sample list to multiple different data providers to get an idea of what their coverage looks like. For the most part, you're going to need 2 data providers to get like 80% coverage of a market. But you might be okay if you have 10,000 leads going with a ZoomInfo or even Apollo, where you're going to get 5,000 leads from it that are matched and that are decent quality. And whichever data provider you're using, the quality is going to be a little bit different. So that's what you want to test when you're reaching out to these different providers. Give them a sample list, see what their coverage looks like, call the leads that they give you. You're looking for mobile phone number, direct dials, company email. If you have those, everything else is kind of a bonus, right? LinkedIn profile generally comes with these things, that kind of stuff. But get that list really squared away so you know when my reps are doing outreach, they're not going to spend a whole bunch of time qualifying if this company is a good fit or not. We're going to have it very organized for them, which saves a ton of time, which means you get information on if our efforts are working, and you're not spending all of this time trying to sort through a crappy lead list, which is preventing you and your team from actually making progress and getting meetings on the calendar or getting deals closed. The next thing I'm going to recommend to you when you're first starting to get out of founder-led sales is make sure you're using one channel at a time. It's very tempting to try and build a sequence of activities where it's like we're going to cold call, then we're going to email them, and then message them on LinkedIn, and then we're going to call them again, and then send another email, and then they're going to open the email, we're going to do this. It's like way too complicated. You want to pick one channel, get that channel working, and then add another channel. So here's what I generally recommend. Start with cold calling. Have reps cold call. Do enough activity so you can learn your own metrics from cold calling. Listen to their calls, give them feedback. As you get traction, you know, hey, if I make 100 calls, I generally book one meeting. then we're in good shape because we know that relationship that I talked about earlier between activities and outcomes. From there, what you want to do is you want to add another channel. Now that might be email, and now you want them personalizing some emails or automating some emails, whatever it might be. I'm not totally against you telling the reps to cold call only while you as the founder test outbound email messaging. That's okay. But when it comes to the rep, have them focus on one channel until it's proven, and then start weaving in other channels like LinkedIn or email as you're starting to figure those out too. Eventually you'll get to a place where it makes sense to weave all these in together strategically. But what I find is founders try to do that part first, and really that's a late stage optimization that you're doing to your outreach that you're trying to pull to the front, and it makes everything slower, more complicated, and very difficult to get any real traction. So just focus on one channel when doing your outreach. And then finally, the last thing I'll leave you in this section here with is you want to systematize and then move to the next thing. So as you're starting to understand the workflow of your first rep, then you have systematized that workflow, and it's very clear that rep knows every single day they come in, they do these things, and we have a rhythm that we follow with our daily workflow. Perfect. Now we move to the next thing. And it might be, how do we follow up with demos after the first call? Or how do we follow up to folks who didn't show up? How do we confirm appointments beforehand to increase our show up rate? You start implementing these processes, and as they work, it's a system that some other rep is going to follow in the future. And now you're building out your process while the rep is enhancing their own workflow. And now you have something you can actually scale. Because the truth is, just having one or two reps being able to hit a number or get close to their number is great. But until you can do that reliably with reps whenever you hire them, and there'll always be duds, but for the main focus at least, you want, as a general rule, for it to be repeated by new reps that you hire, then you can actually scale. Before that, it's going to be very difficult to scale. All right, the next thing here that I want to discuss is hiring the right rep. Here's the reality. Hiring is a very emotional experience, especially when you're hiring your first sales representative, whether it's an SDR or an AE. And that's what I want to talk to you about first here. What do you hire to get yourself out of the sales process? Well, you have a bunch of options here. The first option is you're hiring an account executive to take over you as the seller. Generally, early on, that account executive would be responsible for doing their own outreach. Maybe you have inbound leads. They're going to be working inbound leads as well, and they're going to be booking their own appointments, and they're going to be closing their own deals. That's an option. The other option is to hire SDRs who are going to take over the lead gen process. They might be reaching out to inbounds if you have them. They might be doing cold calling, cold email, cold LinkedIn, whatever it is, following a process to generate appointments for you, who will be the seller closing the deals. Now, which do you pick? And the real answer here is it depends. And I'll give you a couple of heuristics that I use, but ultimately you're gonna have to make this decision on your own. I'll just give you as much information as I can. Generally, the founder early on is going to have the highest close rate. And because of that, I try to keep the founder in a closing role as long as we can. But not all founders are able to. If you find yourself in the position where you can dedicate a lot of your time to sales, it's your number one priority, then hire an SDR to take the prospecting off of your plate, to free up your time to do more sales calls. So then that way, you can just be filled up with sales calls and closing deals to eventually hand off that part of the process to an account executive. So that's one option there. I generally will recommend that for bootstrapped founders because SDRs don't cost as much, and as long as you have some kind of workflow for them to follow, it's a lot easier to get them ramped up and productive than it is an account executive, at least in my experience. Now, we have the account executive as well. So what about them? When does it make sense to hire an account executive? Well, generally I recommend that for founders who really don't have the time they need to dedicate to sales. It may make sense to jump right to an account executive. Or if you've raised money, you might need to hire an account executive. That's really a big part of the decision-making process. The more complex the sale, it adds some complexity to the folks that you hire. So it might make sense to hire a more experienced AE as your first hire. We're going to talk about experience in a minute, but this is where things get a little bit tricky. It's a very transactional sale. You might be less burden on experience, which means generally your cost is going to be lower to have that person, and then we can bring that person to replace you. But my general rule is if you have the time to dedicate to sales, then take the meetings for as long as you can before you bring on an account executive, take over you completely from the sales process. Now, before I talk about rep experience, I want to suggest to you that you hire in twos. So a lot of times it's tempting to hire one person mainly because of cost. And I'll encourage founders in some cases, in most cases actually, to delay that hire as much as they can in order to hire two at once instead of hiring one at a time. And there's a couple of reasons why I recommend that. The first reason is you have two reps you can compare against each other. That way you can see if one's performing really well and the other's not performing well, you know it's more of a personnel issue or a coaching issue than it is a systemic, like our value prop sucks or our product isn't good, that kind of stuff. So that's the first reason why. The second reason why is it puts them in a team. They can collaborate, which is great. They can compete against each other, which is also great. And that team dynamic is really helpful in sales at all stages and even early on. That kind of team competitive nature is really healthy. So I recommend hiring in twos. If you absolutely can't, then you can't. You have to hire one. But if you can wait a little bit because you know you'll be in a place in 6 months where you can hire two at once, I recommend waiting so that way you can bring on two at once because you'll have a little bit more information or a lot more information to use to make decisions around your sales process later. So let's talk about experience level here, because one of the questions I get a lot is how experienced should the people I hire be? And a big part of this is going to be what you can afford. But let me just share with you some of my thoughts when it comes to experience for sales reps at the early stage. It may not be the feedback I give somebody who has a full sales team already, but if you're just starting to get out of founder-led sales, this is what I generally recommend. For account executives, you want to find an AE who has experience selling a similar product or service into a similar ideal customer profile. The ideal customer profile one is the priority. So if it's not a similar product or service, but it's to the same type of buyer, so maybe you sell marketing automation and then the rep that you're evaluating has sold some other marketing tool to CMOs. You both sell to the same buyer, it might be a bit of a different product, that's okay. I prioritize them being able to speak the language of the buyer more than their ability to sell a similar product. But the dream is similar product into a similar market. You really want to over-index on experience. It shortcuts a lot of this. So to really be disciplined and find people who have experience selling to the same buyer with a similar product. The next is workflow of that rep. If you're going to expect them to do their own cold outreach because you don't have an inbound engine yet, that's totally fine. They should have a lot of experience doing it. I don't mean past experience. I mean in their most recent role. It is critical that they understand how to balance their time between booking their own appointments and closing their own deals. So that's for account executives. For SDRs, I take a very different approach. For SDRs, I generally don't like to hire with experience. I like to hire SDRs right out of college and train them up on how to do the activities that I need them to do in order to hit their number. It's a lot easier of a skill to teach, which is why it's less expensive. So spend the time and get them up to speed on a workflow that you found to work, and you can find somebody that's less expensive right out of college. And really two things happen here. One is you have a resource that you get to train on your world, on the prospects you're reaching out to and the product that you sell or the service that you sell. So that's a benefit. But two, that person is now getting really unique experience too. They get to help build the initial SDR function at a company. That's incredibly exciting for folks. So you kind of get the benefits of two things there, which I think is a good argument to go that direction. Doesn't mean you should never hire SDRs with experience. I just generally find more success hiring fresh college grads or people really early in their career for the role. If you do hire for experience with SDRs, I generally recommend finding SDRs with a lot of cold calling experience, because cold calling is a very fundamental skill that also requires a lot of comfort being uncomfortable and a lot of work ethic. So it's helpful to have somebody with that kind of background when you are bringing them into your organization, because they're going to have a good baseline to work off of. All right, the next thing here is track everything. It is critical that you have a good understanding of the metrics from your team. The first part of the tracking is going to be the list itself. Effectively managing the list is a really critical component of this. And here's what I mean. When your reps are doing outreach to the list, we need to be categorizing those leads based on our interactions with those leads. What that looks like is we use something called lead status. Most CRMs have this built in. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna have different statuses for leads based on our interaction. So an open lead, so lead status open, an open lead is one that's never been contacted before. Those get distributed to reps. When reps start calling, emailing, messaging folks in the lead list, they get moved to working. That means we're working this lead, we're trying to get a hold of somebody. When they reply, when they answer the phone, they get marked as connected. This means that we've connected with them. We've had some level of engagement with this prospect. Now, if they book a meeting, they go into meeting booked. That would be one of the lead statuses. And then if they didn't qualify, or it's not a good fit, or there's bad data, they go into a lead status according to that outcome. The reason why we do this is because we want to be able to look at our lead list and say, how many leads have we never reached out to? Are we actively trying to get a hold of, and have we gotten a hold of in the past? And over time, the distribution of activity that your rep is doing, so the calls that they're making to parts of the lead list are going to change. The more folks that you have in that connected bucket, the more time your SDRs will spend calling people who might have said not interested 6 months ago. Well, it's 6 months later. We want to reach out to these people consistently because we know that they answer the phone. We know that they reply to emails. So it's important that you have those organized in that way so you can spend more time reaching out to people that you've had positive interaction with, or any interaction with, in the past. The next part of this is tracking effort metrics. At the end of every day, I expect SDRs and AEs to document what they did that day. How many calls did they make? How many people did they talk to? How many meetings did they book? How many sales calls did they do? I want to have a really good understanding of day by day what effort and outcome metrics we've seen. And I have them manually fill out a spreadsheet. Should this be built out in your CRM? Yes, but I do not automate a spreadsheet or anything to evaluate the team. I want the team manually doing it, and here's why. I believe that it is critical that salespeople take ownership of their own data. Just like leadership should be data-driven on how they're helping the sales team hit their number, the sales team needs to be data-driven on how they are working to hit their number. So by manually having them look at the dashboard and type in numbers in the spreadsheet at the end of every day, it'll take them 3 minutes, but it's gonna make it conscious to them, their activities. Maybe an SDR wanted to make 100 calls that day, but they only made 70. They're gonna go, oh shoot, okay, tomorrow I really need to pick up my call volume because today I didn't hit the number I wanted to hit. Great, now that's on their radar, so the next day they can make up for that. But if it's just being logged in the CRM and leadership is just looking at it in the CRM, there's a gap between the rep's understanding and the leadership's understanding. And that gap gets filled when you have them manually take ownership of their own data. So it's something that I'm pretty passionate about. The final thing here is how you are using your deal stages. Now, everyone uses deal stages a little bit differently. I see some pretty wild stuff. I see folks who have a deal stage 1 that's like a good prospect, and deal stage 2 would be we have booked a meeting with them. Deal stage 3 will be we did a demo. Deal stage 4 will be something random, technical review. Deal stage 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Like, they'll have all of these deal stages. And when you have it very complicated like that and you have a ton of stages, what ends up happening are sales reps skip stages. So you actually don't have a clear stage 1, 2, 3, 4. You have a stage 1 to stage 4 to stage 5 to stage 7 because you're skipping over it, and each journey looks very different. It makes it difficult for you to figure out where's the real drop off between stages. Now, on the flip side of that, I see people who build out super simple deal stages. It's like 1 stage demo. And that's it. And sometimes there's follow-up calls, or there might be a discovery call first and then they book a demo, but they don't log a deal when the discovery call is booked. Instead, they only log the deal when the demo is booked. We miss out on a lot of data when we do it that way. So here are my best practices for this. The first thing you're going to do is write out all of the possible meetings that could take place between a meeting, an initial call getting booked, and a deal getting made. All of those meetings, lay them out. Not just the required ones for you, but any possible ones that a customer might ask for, or a potential customer. When you have all those listed out, you want to organize them in stages. Not every meeting will be mandatory, but every meeting needs a stage. And if for that company it is a mandatory meeting, we don't move the stage of the deal. We follow that company's process to make sure they have what they need to drive us to the next stage as well. This allows you to have a clear structure for your own sales process and also stay flexible to your buyer's buying process. So you map all those meetings out, you organize them by stages, and then you put exit criteria. What is required to go from the first stage to the second stage? So for example, let's say deal stage 1 is a discovery stage where we're diving deep and trying to understand the problems that they're experiencing. We'll have the discovery stage, and then deal stage 2 might be demo. So in the stage 1, discovery, there's a discovery call. In stage 2, there's a demo call, but there also might be technical demonstration because that specific company wants their IT team to come in and make sure that it looks like we're going to be able to implement this type of solution into their environment. They might do that really early on because they want to make sure they check that box before they pull in executive leadership to evaluate the solution. Great. We'll make sure that that's part of our process, but that's still going to be in the demo stage, not part of evaluating or whatever your next stage is. So that's what I want you to think about here. What exit criteria is required to move through each of the stages? Have some core meetings that are required for every deal that you as a company require, and also have the optional stages to where if it's required by the customer, it must happen before the next stage is met. I've done a lot of content around deal stages, so if you'd like to watch a video on that, definitely check them out. I go pretty deep into deal stage and how you should organize them in some other videos, so I wanted to keep this one a little bit higher level. Now here's the final thing, and this is really important here. Iterate with data. You've heard me talk about data a lot. I'm very data driven when it comes to sales teams because I think it gives us everything we need to figure out how to be successful. Luckily, sales gets to be very data driven. It should be one of the most data driven parts of the organization, but often it's treated like a mystical, magical, artistic thing when it really should be very detailed and very dialed in. So the first thing I'm going to say here is actually going back to what we talked about earlier. That model you built out where you understand all of the conversion rates along the way, what you want to do when you're iterating with data is you want to look at your real world data, look at your model and say, what doesn't match? And if things don't match, if some things are better, you put it in there. If some things are worse, you put it in there. And you look and see what impact does that have. And what you'll find is that the things that aren't as good as they need to do are going to hurt you. The things that are a little bit better might make up for it. But by having that realistic view, you can focus on the things that don't match the model to improve them. And as you make those improvements and as other areas get improved, you'll start to see compounding efforts here because each step of your process is getting a little bit more effective. Now, part of that is making sure we take a look at deal stage drop-off. So we talked about deal stages earlier. Where are the drop-offs? How can we prevent that drop-off? So what do? We find the stage with the biggest drop-off. So maybe it's between deal stage 1 and deal stage 2. And then we ask ourselves, why are folks dropping off here? We listen to the calls. We talk to the sales reps. We understand, why are people dropping off? Are they booking the next step and not showing up to it? Are they not even booking the next step on the call? Are they listening and saying they're not interested? Are they not listening at all? And we need to fix the demo script, right? These are the types of things you want to understand to try to fix that drop-off rate. And then here's the final thing I'll leave you with. You need to fix one thing at a time. Do not try to solve all of the problems. Pick one metric that you want to fix, create a hypothesis on how to fix that metric, and then go and fix it. If you repeat that process with data over and over and over again and follow the other things that I shared with you in this video, what you're going to find is that you're going to be able to not only build a sales process that is repeatable, you're also going to build a sales process that gets better and better and better and can be scaled when you bring on new reps. And that ultimately at the end of the day is what you need to do to be able to hit really incredible growth metrics.